so my background started in search, built distributed systems in search, and then joined Square. I was there for 6 years. Started when we were 10 people, and then was there through the IPO and after it as well. I helped build out that team. We were 10 when I joined, 2,500 when I left, roughly. Then started a few companies, and then sold one. Yeah, I've always been like hardware, software. Something hardware, software, distributed systems is basically like my bread and butter. Not as good of an engineer as I used to be.
I guess it's a transition, right?
Yeah. I love writing code still. Like I still do. I did last night. It's like it's important to keep doing it.
That makes sense.
It's getting a lot easier now with Cursor and other things.
And thanks to AI?
Yeah, it really has been. Like I wrote a mobile app last weekend, in a weekend. Like full stack all the way with like, I don't know, just a few prompts. It was incredible. Like I hate writing mobile applications. Like I'm a backend engineer, so like I'm not really into the front end. I care about good front ends, but I don't know how to build them very well. And like Cursor is kind of a superpower, I think. It's actually really impressed.
So what's the biggest problem for Helium right now?
On the IoT side, it's like organic growth of usage. On the mobile side, it's growing the network. Right? It's like growing the network specifically in the US. The primary place where we're seeing a lot of value is this Wi-Fi offload product.
No, I think that might be too much of noise.
It's just it won't connect to the Wi-Fi unless the door is. So I'll be able to pick up proper audio just virtual level.
Yeah, they don't allow to set up something before the time.
Oh, really?
It's only the moment you start. That's the only time that they allow you to start. So it's a bit.
So it's recording, right?
Yeah, it's recording. And even if the Wi-Fi is not connected, it's recording.
Okay, then let's go.
So it's fine. You good to start?
Yep.
So let's begin understanding where Helium stands right now with its IoT progress and with a new network and a broader perspective of the whole IoT sphere from your angle.
Sure. Yeah. And so Helium started in 2019. Sort of very rapidly built an IoT network that spans, effectively every country in the world, but a lot of the focus is on the US and Europe, I would say. Most of the sort of best coverage is there. Over 300,000 hotspots deployed and active today. And you can build something like a package tracking application. Let's say you have a high value item. This morning, I saw somebody tweet that they got a PSA graded 10 Pikachu, like a Japanese Pikachu, that had a sticker tracker that was attached to it, and they were able to see it from the warehouse all the way to their house. And that's possible because of something like Helium IoT, right? And that took many years to really build. Like it's a novel network, right? It's not like your typical Wi-Fi or LTE network. It's a new protocol, and so because of that, it takes some time to bootstrap the network. But now that it is ubiquitous and it's so affordable, it's easy for somebody to build an application on it. Right? And I think that I see this every day, and it's now just kind of fun to see it. But people are able to build some really useful things for things that they truly care about. Because that's been the progress on the IoT side. We've had sort of the full range of the sort of hype cycle of people deploying hotspots, and the interesting thing about the network and the rewards model for the network is as there's too much coverage, there is actually back pressure in the economics.
It's not like any mining.
Yeah,
it's a supply and demand.
Putting the 1,000th IoT node in San Francisco is not very useful. Right? Really, putting the 100th is probably not very useful anymore. And so, that's what you see, and you're seeing sort of more activation happening in Africa and Asia because you're realizing that deploying in Europe and the US is not really relevant anymore. In many places, there's still rural areas where it still makes sense to deploy for agriculture use cases, but certainly the urban environments are very well saturated. Which I think the network has worked from that perspective. The model has worked for that deployment in a very short amount of time.
Can you tell me a little more about the supply chain? Because what you're doing, this example that you mentioned, is almost like a supply chain tracking.
Sure.
Is there any real enterprise use cases, institutional use cases, using it for anything on the supply chain side?
Yeah, there's a couple. There are a couple of companies that use it for tracking. So there's a company that's built a platform. Effectively, they make their own packaging material, and that packaging material has a helium tracker inside of it, and it's a reusable bag, effectively, a boxer bag. And so, an e-commerce company can put clothes in there, send it to you. You take the 4 things that you like, and maybe the 6 things you don't like, and you return it to that same bag, and they can track it the whole way from distribution all the way back to return.
Okay.
Right, and that's better than FedEx, arguably.
So they'll know that if you're wearing it for a party, they will find out.
Potentially, like if you put a tracker in the actual, on the piece of clothing, and you decided to tag it off, I guess you probably could. I don't know if there's anyone doing that exactly, but certainly for high-end items, I think it certainly makes sense to have a little bit more protection, right, for things like that. I think the card thing is kind of interesting. People are tracking art. People are tracking. I know there's a car parts company that's based in the Bay Area, selling high-end carbon fiber parts for people's cars. And when you're sending a $10,000 piece of carbon fiber to somebody, you want to know exactly where it is at all times because you want to provide the best customer experience for them. So they're able to leverage the Helium network for things like that on the IoT side. So our existing network is useful, and we're seeing organic use cases like that in the US. I think my favorite European example is this. There's a endangered lynx tracking.
Endangered?
Lynx, so it's a cat that is endangered in the Iberian Peninsula. And so what they're doing, what this company Green Metrics is doing, which I think is pretty amazing, is they have cameras deployed all around the areas where they roam. Their territory.
So they connect all of this to the hotspots.
And so the cameras themselves have a little AI chip in them that is able to detect whether it's a cat that went by, the lynx that went by, and if it does, it sends a very small message over the Helium network, over the long distance that's available over the Helium network, and then that system processes that data and sends it back down to Waze, which is a navigation app. And in Waze, you see a little notification saying, "Hey, slow down." Because the biggest problem that they're having is people are just running into these endangered animals.
So in this particular example, it is not using your existing consumer hotspot network. It's their own cameras that they set up, and they're connecting all of that to your network.
Correct. So they have cameras that use this LoRaWAN protocol that the community has deployed the gateways for them. So they didn't have to deploy their own gateways. All they had to deploy is the cameras.
Okay.
And that's...
So does the camera actually get the reward? Because they're also hotspots right now.
The cameras aren't rewarded.
Okay.
The cameras are deployed by this company.
Okay.
And they're able to provide the service. The same company does things like flood detection.
Okay.
When the Dubai floods happened, something that you're probably very familiar with, this company had just been activated in Valencia, if I remember correctly, to basically address the sort of floods that were happening in different parts of the city and sort of direct emergency services to the right part of the city to sort of clean up as quickly as possible. And this company has been using the Helium network for years now. And there's several companies like this in Europe that have been using this network, and they don't need to deploy any coverage because the coverage is already deployed. And that's sort of the interesting kinds of use cases that we're seeing in the last few years.
So can you elaborate more on the IoT did not pick up as an industry, and that would have its obvious effects here. So your ideal challenge at this point is to grow the network, grow the data, grow the usage of companies and individuals and corporates. Can you elaborate more? What is the challenge and what is the solution you see around it?
IoT was just a very big promise, right? We'll have billions of devices all providing small amounts of data and all providing some kind of insight. But what I think really happened was that there's a lot of siloing for these kinds of things, right? So you had, folks, creating little data silos, creating their own applications, but they're not really building this sort of consumer. They're not really consumerizing it, even on the sort of B2B side. They're not really consumerizing it for that business customer. And so you end up having lots of fragmented networks. Some were LTE based, some were other IoT protocol base. LoRaWAN, the protocol that Helium deploys on the IoT side, is a relatively primarily driven by private deployments. There wasn't really a global network outside of this one network of things, but even that network was very much in pockets. And so there wasn't a singular network that sort of combined all these things together. When you're thinking about a tracking application, for example, you don't want to think about, I want to use this one network in this city, and then when my package goes to the next city, I have to then connect to another network and configure the sensor to be able to do that, and then the next city a different network. That makes it hard for you to build the application on the sensor side. Whereas if you have a single ubiquitous network that's where you can start to see some interesting use cases. And I think we're only starting to see that now because the network's available. I think the future of the Helium IoT network is more this sort of collaborative, sort of use the private networks where it exists, roam on the Helium network where those exist and sort of gaps, and then fall back maybe on further private networks. And these sensors, if they're able to seamlessly use the Helium network and other networks that are out there, I think that becomes kind of interesting. And also these private network operators, they can take their sensors and also use the Helium network wherever they have enough data, right? The OpEx of deploying new coverage, they don't really have to think about that. There's already a network that they can use. So if they're deploying into a city, deploying sensors in a city that they've never worked in, they can just use the Helium network that already exists. I think IoT as a sort of industry had a couple of false starts, and I think there's still a lot of value in a network like ours, and other networks like ours, I think as well. I think it's a matter of kind of standardization. The other thing, I'll give you another good example, kind of an anecdotal example. There isn't a single standard for LoRaWAN in Africa, even to this day. And there's an opportunity to build really, really great sort of applications there. So we actually decided last year that we were going to create a standard. We worked with the ATU, which is the equivalent of the African Telecom Union, regulator effectively across the continent. And we said, we would like to deploy this particular frequency band. It's not like Wi-Fi where everyone knows what frequency it is. We had to sort of be assertive and say, this is what we'd like to deploy here. And if you're okay with that, we'll tell our sort of network and community to deploy this particular frequency. And I think that's going to create African coverage in the next few years. And those are the kinds of things that you sort of have to do to sort of force the issue almost by collaborating with folks that are there.
Interesting. So at this point, if there is a new influx of with the AI revolution that's going on, people are trying to think more about what the data can mean and what they can do with the data, interpreting it. If IoT and AI can integrate in some way, live reading of information, because even when you talk about the cats detected on the ways, AI can enhance a lot around it. So do you see there is any possibility of increased interest in IoT right now because of all this progress in the AI side?
Potentially. I think that one use case is a great one, right? You don't need to send the full camera stream to some centralized server to then process that data and then send it back to some other network, right? That's a lot of bandwidth usage, and if you have hundreds of cameras, do you really need to process all of them at the same time? Doing it at the edge makes the most sense. And cameras for environmental tracking isn't the only use case, right? It could be things like fire detection. It could be, things like security in cities. We can do a lot of things around it where edge detection makes a lot more sense, and being able to sort of process that data at the edge and then send small amounts of useful data that can be aggregated somewhere else. I think that is a use case for these kinds of IoT networks. It reduces costs, right? You don't have to, as I said, the bandwidth cost is often the biggest cost of this. It also reduces the hardware cost of the end node, right? The end node can be smaller, have smaller radios, use less power. Ultimately, if it's able to do one job really, really well at the edge and then send the smaller packets, often most of your power consumption outside of compute is actually the transport.
Yeah. So right now, the 2024-25, we call this as the institutional era for the world of blockchain, right? More and more institutions are adopting it. So what is the kind of conversations you're having with them? Or what is their reason for either adopting Helium or not adopting, or like the challenges, okay, we don't want to do it until we see something else happen. So what is that conversation looking like?
The places that want to adopt are usually, they don't want to sort of miss the opportunity, right? Like they clearly understand that there's innovation happening here. Like we are in this sort of what is now called the deep learning sector, right? And the sort of different way of deploying infrastructure is like, relevant. They're interested in this kind of other way of doing things. So from that perspective, they're very interested in being participant. I think there are some headwinds though. I think a lot of them are regulatory. Like there's some questions around, what is like, will this space have the support in every country that that's sort of considering these things? There's some countries that are a lot more ahead of this than others. Some regions that are a lot more ahead of this than others as well. And so you definitely are seeing some hesitation. We're thankfully, I think, a part of crypto that is just pure utility, right? So, we're one of those like sort of non-financial use cases. And so what's nice about that is we can kind of explain ourselves in a very non-crypto way and say, look, like, do you want a network that was easier to build or cheaper to build or faster to build, like by orders of magnitude? If so, then, the crypto parts of this, you can kind of hide that away. Right, like those are the parts, and they're not hide in a sort of nefarious way. It's really just it can be abstracted and solve for the like regulatory uncertainty over time. And I think that we're seeing, like I spend some time on the policy side of the U.S. Like we're starting to see some of the actual motion, right? And I think that we will get resolution somewhat soon in the U.S. I think we'll get resolution in other large countries as well, and we see places like Hong Kong being somewhat ahead of these things, Dubai being somewhat ahead of these things, parts of Europe actually surprisingly like being somewhat ahead of these things in some places at least.
Are you actually doing something in Dubai or UAE?
We today aren't, not actively. Mostly the telecom side is like fairly like centralized, so there isn't a lot of opportunity, I think, there. But I do know that there are people deploying Helium hotspots there, right? There are IoT hotspots deployed in Dubai. I don't know of any specific use cases that are there, but I certainly know that, because it's a permissionless network, you can deploy it wherever you have, wherever you are able to.
So you don't restrict them even if that data is not going to be helpful for you?
I mean, coverage, I think, is like the beginning of the IoT network is really around coverage is coverage, right? Like create the coverage. And if there's ubiquitous coverage, people will start to build applications. It's very different on the mobile side, and we can talk about that a little bit. I think with the mobile side, you have to match demand and supply, right? It doesn't really make sense to just, spray a bunch of Wi-Fi hotspots in an area that doesn't have a lot of slow-moving people. That's where that's always the joke, that sort of tongue-in-cheek way that I describe where you should deploy a mobile hotspot is like, where are there a lot of slow-moving people? Malls, coffee shops, city plazas and promenades, parks. Like these are the places where you might be, start scrolling through TikTok or Instagram, and you need like high bandwidth applications. You're streaming something. You are the streamer for something. These are the places where it makes sense to do so, right? And so, mobile very, very different from a deployment perspective than IoT. IoT is create the ubiquitous coverage, which is a novel network. Mobile, it's a infill network. It's providing an enhancement to something that's already existing. And so those should be sort of tailored.
There are quite a few companies who came as a competitor to Helium, but they all turned on to become eSIM companies, and many others, they went away from this particular solution. Have you ever considered other byproducts or products that you could work with outside of the core scope of the network?
I think that our network is pretty flexible, as a flexible economic model that allows a lot of any kind of network technically to be launched into a regulated ecosystem. We have a governance process for that. And so certainly there are other networks that could use our protocol and could use the economic model. But I would also recommend people just to fork it. Everything we built is open source, right? And I've definitely worked with a lot of teams personally to help them launch their own using our existing infrastructure that we have. And I think that's the better model, because you want to have a protocol team that is really, really aligned with the particular product that you're shipping. I don't know a whole lot personally about other kinds of deep things that are out there, right? But I don't know much about like compute networks, and that's not what I spend most of my time on. But the compute network still has roughly the same like core like protocol building blocks, right? They have a rewardable asset. For a compute network, it's a CPU or a GPU. They have a set of wallets that need to be rewarded. They're using Solana. We're in Solana, so folks like that can very easily fork what we have and deploy their own that sort of fits their network, or kind of use our network for connectivity or use our network for other things as well. With over 300,000 hotspots deployed out there, those all used to be full nodes on World L1, and now they're pretty much like clients. There's a lot of latent compute on there, and I'd love for people to use that latent compute. And I think there are a few projects out there that are.
Do you by any chance have a grant program for businesses that are building around Helium?
Yeah, the foundation does support people that are building. They primarily focus, they do less on the sort of deployment side. If it's, I want to deploy a bunch of sensors or I want to deploy a bunch of hotspots, that doesn't really make sense for the foundation. But if it's, I want to launch a new protocol, I want to like enable this sort of massive sort of set of use cases that are actually driving.
So basically, deep in startups.
Yeah. So like deep, they have the capability of supporting networks like that.